welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and it's time for another Magic Rules video. And today I'm going to be talking about combat. But before I get to the main topic, of course, I like to cover the comments. You know, whenever I make one of these videos, I look at the comments, and sometimes I'll answer those comments in the comment section, and sometimes I like to grab them because either they're a general comment that I think I should cover on the next video, or it is relevant to the next video I'm making. And in fact, the video I'm making today is because of a few comments that I got. And I'll start with a comment from Everett from Netherland, who said, MTG has got to be the only game where so many players are oblivious to certain rules, yet are still able to play and have a good time. I thought that was a great comment, and it is very interesting. You know, Magic the Gathering is probably the most complicated game on the planet. The rule book is enormous. Even someone like me that has been playing for almost 30 years doesn't understand every single interaction. Sometimes people ask me questions that I don't know the answer to, but it is kind of funny that you can very easily play the game without knowing hardly the rules at all, right? So even if you're not a rules lawyer, you can still very much enjoy this game. However, that brings me to another comment from Christopher Eggett. I recently was playing Commander. I had a question regarding the command zone. An opponent claimed his commander's abilities were active in the command zone. I had trouble wrapping my head around this and wanted to know if this is really possible. So the reason I grabbed this question is, first of all, the way he said an opponent claimed, okay? And unfortunately, this is another aspect of the game where sometimes people have the rules wrong, first of all, and they're not doing it on purpose. They just maybe picked it up from someone else who was doing it wrong. And you can play a lot of times in play groups using the wrong rules and not knowing you're doing so. But also sometimes you can actually have people that are being dishonest about it. It's unfortunate. Again, just like with any game, you got cheaters, you got people that are going to be taking advantage of people that don't know the rules as well. So if you got one guy, and sometimes in a play group, you can sort of have an alpha personality where that guy is sort of directing how the group works. And that guy will be like, oh, no, that's the way it works. Trust me. And everyone will just go along with it, even though that's not the case. Sometimes they're just wrong, but sometimes they are actually cheating. It's unfortunate that people do these kinds of things. It does happen. I've been in games before where someone is like, no, it works this way, obviously to advantage themselves. And clearly the other people that had played with that person before on many occasions just went along with it. And I'm like, actually, no, it does not work that way. It can be an uncomfortable situation sometimes, but I think it is absolutely necessary. So getting to the actual question, yes, there are commanders that do work from the command zone, but it has to specifically say so, right? The Eminence ability, which everyone is a huge fan of, works in the command zone, but it specifically says on that card that it does work from the command zone. Oloro is another commander that specifically references the command zone. His ability works, or some of his abilities work when in the command zone. That's probably a perfect example, right? It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 2 life. Whenever you gain life, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card and each opponent loses 1 life. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Oloro, Ageless Ascetic, is in the command zone, you gain 2 life. So that ability specifically references the command zone, so it will trigger when your commander is in the command zone. The first 2 abilities do not, though. The at the beginning of upkeep, you gain 2 life. That part, the first ability, only works when your commander's on the battlefield. Just like if it was in your hand, it wouldn't do anything, right? Abilities on creatures only work when they're on the battlefield unless it specifically says otherwise. The other ability, whenever you gain life, you can pay 1, also only works when your commander's on the battlefield. The only ability that actually triggers when your commander is in the command zone is that last one that specifically references the command zone, right? So unless an ability specifically mentions the command zone or that it works in the command zone, it does not. So you do have to be careful with that in case you have an opponent that is claiming otherwise. All right, from DM Dingo, I'm a bit confused on how blinking, flickering, and phasing work, especially when there are other things involved. Is there a difference between blinking and phasing? What happens to equipment, counters, enchantments, auras, configured creatures, all this good stuff? Okay, so I maybe could make an entire video about phasing. It is a very complicated ability, kind of, you know. They actually sort of phased it out, pun intended, for a long time, and then I decided to bring it back, you know, because it actually didn't work really well with the interactions of the game. Now, blinking is something completely different. Blinking is just a phrase that players use, right? It's lingo, and you can go check out my lingo video. I got a couple lingo videos that go over the lingo that Magic players use. They're not actually official game terms. So you do have to be careful with differentiating between just Magic lingo and the actual game terms. Blinking and flickering are not actual game terms, and they are not like phasing at all. Typically, you're blinking something, you are exiling it, and then it comes back into play, whether it means right away or at the beginning of the next end step, whatever. Flickering, same thing. Blinking, flickering are used sort of synonymously with each other. Phasing, of course, is very different, and yes, your counters, all of that stuff still is there. That's why phasing is so great. If you have a creature with a bunch of counters on it, it will phase back in on untap. All those counters will still be there. If there's auras attached to it, it will still be there. If there's equipment attached to it, it will still be there. Anything attached to that creature, when you phase it out, will phase out with it, and then it phases back in. So that's why phasing is really, really handy in the format. Matthew Rincon says, I would like a video topic of explaining the Sundial usage. I keep seeing everyone use it wrong. People misread things like at the beginning of your next end step or end of turn, and you try to save it with Sundial. All it does in most cases is save whatever until the end of the very next turn. So yes, I've seen this done incorrectly as well. So Sundial the Infinite, obviously he's talking about. Obeka is the exact same way, and I played against one of my patrons who had an Obeka deck recently who, again, did not do this correctly. At the end of turn and at the beginning of your next end step are two completely different things, okay? End of turn happens on the cleanup. Next end step happens on your end step. So if something happens at the beginning of the next end step, you can shut it off because it is a triggered ability, right? That's what you're doing there. The beginning of your next end step, that's an actual phase and that's an actual triggered ability. That ability will go on the stack, and then when you end the turn, it cleans everything off of the stack. Again, I talked about this in my stack video with Time Stop, which works the same way. At the end of turn things, that's not the case, okay? If you have a giant growth effect, which gives your creature +3/+3 until end of turn, Sundial of the Infinite or Time Stop or Obeka will not help there until end of turn things happen on cleanup. That's when you deal with all of that stuff, right? Your cleanup step, your discarding down to hand size, any until end of turn effects will wear off. A end the turn thing is not going to save it because you're ending the turn, right? So any end the turn stuff will wear off. If you giant grow something, that will wear off because you're ending the turn. So you have to make sure you differentiate those things, especially if you're playing that Obeka deck. Something that says until end of turn is not going to work there. And again, you have to be very careful. Some of these things have been errated that used to end at the end of a turn, but actually are at the beginning of the next end step. So you have to be careful with the wording there as well. Lalo Renza has a question. Do all the phases in the turn always happen? If I play Sanctum of Stone Fangs and have no creatures, does the ability resolve even though I don't have a combat phase? And of course, I'm getting into what I'm talking about today, which is combat with this question. And the answer is yes. So first of all of your phases will always happen in a turn, right? It's untap, upkeep, draw, your first main phase, and then it will go to your combat phase, then your second main phase, and then end phase, okay? All of those phases will always happen on everyone's turn, unless, of course, you have cards that specifically say otherwise, like skip your upkeep, skip your draw. Anything that says skip a phase, obviously will skip that phase on your turn or whoever else's turn it applies to. Cards always trump any of these rules, right? Whatever it says on the cards will always trump what the actual rules are. So first of all, let's look at the card Sanctum of Stone Fangs, which is 1 and a black, legendary enchantment shrine. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of shrines you control. So this card has nothing to do with combat. Even though it says pre-combat main phase, that is your first main phase. So even if you did skip your combat, you would still get this trigger. However, there are lots of things that trigger at the beginning of combat, right? There's things that trigger at the beginning of combat on your turn. There's stuff that your opponents might have that trigger at the beginning of combat on every turn, and you cannot skip those. What's going to happen on a turn is you're going to have your first main phase. Typically, you'll cast some spells, you'll play a land, whatever. And then again, you'll pass priority, like I talked about in my stack video, where your opponents have a chance to do something before you move to combat. And even if you're not planning on attacking with creatures, even if you don't even have any creatures, you will immediately go to at the beginning of combat. Again, unless you have something that specifically says you skip your combat phase, and there is a few of those cards, you're going to go to at the beginning of combat. You will enter the combat phase. Anything that triggers at the beginning of combat will trigger. Then immediately after that, you will go to declare attackers, right? If it's your turn, you're the one declaring attackers. Nobody can do anything. Once it's your turn to declare attackers, your opponents just sit there and wait for you to declare attackers. They can't do anything once you've entered the declare attackers step, and you will decide who you want to attack, right? And of course in Commander, we got like 3 opponents, maybe more, and you will maybe attack this guy with one, this guy with another. Your opponents can't actually do anything until you finish declaring all your attackers. I mean, they can threaten you, which of course people like to do. Better not attack me or else you're going to get it. Of course they can do that, but they can't actually cast spells, activate abilities, anything like that until you've completely finished declaring your attackers. Then, after you've said, I'm done declaring attackers, now they have an opportunity to do things before we go to the next step. Now, if you don't declare attackers, which happens all the time, right? Especially early in the game, you're not going to be declaring any attackers. So what will happen is you will go to at the beginning of combat phase. Again, anything that triggers at the beginning of combat will trigger. Then you will go to declare attackers and you'll say, okay, well, I'm not declaring any attackers. And if you're not declaring any attackers, then there's no reason for the next few steps, and you will immediately skip to the end of combat. So you're not skipping any phases, but you are skipping steps. The next steps being, of course, declare blockers and damage step. There's no need for that because there's no attacking creatures, right? So that stuff you will skip over and go directly to the end of combat step. Now, if you have declared attackers, of course, then you will go to the next step, which is declaring blockers. And again, like I said in the last video, it is very important that we go in turn order, right? When your opponents are declaring blockers, it's the next person in turn order that declares which creatures they are blocking with, and then the next one and the next one. And again, you can't do anything when your opponents are declaring their blockers. You're just sitting there. They're making the decision on which creatures are going to block which, and it is not until after all blockers are declared that you are now able to do something. And once blockers are declared, you will then assign damage. And again, of course, the important part here is that all damage will be assigned at the same time, with, of course, some exceptions. The most notable exception is going to be first strike. As soon as a first strike creature or double strike, which I will get to, is involved in combat, you've now created a new step, the first strike damage step, right? So what's going to happen on damage is the first strike damage is going to be assigned first before any other damage is assigned. Now, this might not actually accomplish anything, or it might actually accomplish something. Of course, the most relevant part being that you might kill your opponent's creature before they have any chance to do damage to your creature. There's a lot of situations where it actually can be relevant, but other than the first strike, double strike situation, all damage is going to get dealt at the exact same time. The damage that is dealt to the blocking creatures and the attacking creatures and the players, all of that damage happens all at the exact same time. And of course, that can be very important. And then of course, after damage is dealt, then you will go to the end of combat phase. And a very important thing about the end of combat is any creatures that you have declared as attackers are still attacking creatures. Again, this is a very important part that can play into a lot of different mechanics. Okay, once you declare your creature as an attacker on your declare attacker step, that is an attacking creature until combat is over. So after your creature does damage, you can actually do something with it. So for example, you have a Mazavith. After your creature's actually dealt damage to a player, you can now use your Mazavith to untap it if you want to, because it's still an attacking creature. Ninjutsu is another way that you can sort of manipulate this, right? Because Ninjutsu says return an unblocked attacker you control to hand. Put this card onto the battlefield from your hand, tapped and attacking. So what you can do, if you have a creature that you want to deal damage with, if it's unblocked, you deal damage to your opponent with it, and then after you've already dealt damage, you can still ninjutsu in one of your ninjas if you want to pick it up or if you want to get that ninja on the table. People don't typically do this because a lot of ninjas have those deal damage triggers on them, but you can do that if you want to. It's still an unblocked attacking creature, even though it's already dealt damage. Let's talk about blocking here a little bit. Quite a bit to talk about there. And I got another comment here. THCAT Bob said, me and my Magic pod all started playing within the last 6 months. We just learned today that blocking creatures doesn't cause them to tap, which is interesting. Again, there's just sort of these ideas that sort of saturate into the environment, and sometimes your whole play group can have this incorrect information and you all play that way, and it ends up working out. Everyone still has a fun, interesting game, even though you're using the rules incorrectly. So I assume what he means here is that when your creature blocks, it becomes tapped, which of course is not the case. Now, there is an important interaction here that does matter, and the rules have changed on this quite a bit. This is one that I actually had wrong for a while because they changed the rule and I was not aware. Back in the day, it used to be that if you blocked with a creature, now of course tapped creatures can't block, but you could block with a creature and then tap it to use its ability. So if I have my Arcanist the Omnipotent, I can chump my opponent's giant creature, and then after I've declared it as a blocker, before the damage step, before any damage is done to my creature, I can respond by tapping it to draw 3 cards. Now, the way it used to work is a tapped creature did not deal damage. So my Arcanist, once I've tapped it to draw 3 cards, would not deal the 3 damage to my opponent's attacking creature. They changed that rule though. Now it does. Now if I tap my Arcanist, draw 3 cards, once we reach the damage step, I actually will deal damage to that creature. I gotta say, I don't love that rule. I'm not sure why they changed it. Nevertheless, that's the way it is. One rule I'm very glad they changed that they had briefly was that damage used the stack. Okay, so what you would have is like a Mog Fanatic or Sakura Tribe Elder. Those 2 cards got way, way better when they had this rule. What you could do is you could block with one of those creatures, assign the damage to the attacking creature, and then still sacrifice them to use their ability in response. Terrible idea. I don't think anyone liked that. They got rid of it. So I don't know if there's anyone out there that still thinks that's a thing, but it is not. You can't do that. If I have a Sakura Tribe Elder or a Mog Fanatic, I chump, and then after I've declared it as a blocker, I sacrifice it to use its ability. It's no longer a blocker, and it's not going to deal any damage because it's not there by the time we've reached the damage step. Now, it still is blocked. And again, this is another thing that's very important. Once a creature is declared blocked, it's blocked. Removing the creature out of the way doesn't do anything. If you got a 10/10 creature and you're going in for damage and your opponent chumps with their creature and in response you use a removal spell to get rid of it, doesn't do anything. Your creature is still blocked. So it's not going to get any damage through unless of course it has Trample. And of course Trample is an ability that I got to cover here. It is really important. Now, Trample specifically works in a way that any damage that isn't done to the blocking creature is going to be done to the player. Essentially, I have to assign lethal damage to that creature, and then whatever's left over, I can trample over to the player, right? So if I have a 6/6 trampling creature, my opponent has a 2/2 blocker, they throw their 2/2 in the way, I have to assign lethal damage to that creature, which is 2. I need 2 damage in order to kill it, and then whatever's left over, which will be 4, will trample over to the player. Now, if we go back to the removal situation, if my opponent assigns that 2/2 creature as a blocker, I can now, even though my creature is blocked, use that removal spell to get it out of the way. Now I don't have to assign lethal damage to it. It's already dead. So now all 6 of my trample damage is going to trample over to that player. So in that situation, it actually will make a difference. My creature is still blocked, right? It has been assigned a blocker, but there is no lethal damage I have to deal to that blocker now because it's gone. So all the damage will trample over. This also works with Death Touch. Again, another very specific ability when it comes to combat, means that any amount of damage that I assign to a creature is lethal damage. This works exceptionally well with Trample, which is why you never see a creature that has both Trample and Death Touch printed on it. Again, I got my 6/6 creature. I've managed to give it Death Touch, say with a Bow of Nylea or something, right? It's an attacking creature, so it gains Death Touch. My opponent can now block with 5 10/10 creatures, okay? This is how ridiculous this combination is. 5 10/10 creatures are now blocking my 6/6 Trample Death Touch creature. I only need to assign lethal damage, and then I can trample the rest over. Lethal damage when you have Death Touch is any amount of damage, which means I only need to assign 1 damage to each of those creatures. So even though my opponent is putting 50 toughness in front of my 6/6 creature, I only need to assign 1 damage to each of them, and I will still trample over for damage, even though there's this giant wall of enormous creatures in front of me. So those 5 10/10 creatures will all die, and I'll still trample over for 1 damage. That's how powerful that combination is. Another ability that works really, really well with Trample is Double Strike. And again, this is why you're very rarely, there are a couple, but you're very rarely going to see Trample and Double Strike stapled on a creature because those work really, really well together. And I will get to, again, another question first by Tarl. I have a question with with combat, more specifically double strike. If a double strike creature is blocked and the blocking creature dies in the first hit, is the second hit negated, or does the second hit get through for damage? Does this only happen when trample is involved? So yes, you answered your own question. It only happens when trample is involved. So double strike, obviously very specific ability. As I already mentioned, when you have a double strike or first strike creature on the battlefield in combat, you have to sort of create that first strike damage step. You attack with your double strike creature, your opponent blocks, assuming it doesn't have first strike, right? So if your opponent's blocking creature has first strike or double strike, it's going to match up, right? That's going to do damage in the first strike damage step as well. But assuming it does not, your creature is going to deal its damage first, just like it would with first strike, and then it will also deal damage in the normal damage step, right? That's what double strike means. It deals damage in the first strike step and also in the normal damage step. So if I've got that 2/2 double strike creature and my opponent has a 4/4 creature and they block, my creature is going to deal 2 damage in the first strike damage step, and then in the regular damage step, both creatures are now going to deal damage. So my creature is going to die, but their creature is going to die as well. However, if my creature just blocks with a 2/2, their creature is going to die in the first strike damage step. Now we've gotten to the regular damage step, and my creature still has 2 damage to deal. However, again, it's already been blocked, right? It doesn't matter if that creature has been removed through a removal spell or through first strike damage or whatever. My creature's already blocked, and a blocked creature does not get through for damage, right? So it is not going to deal any damage to anything. It's going to be swinging at open air. There's no creature there for it to kill because it already killed the creature, and it's been blocked, so it will not be dealing any damage to the player. However, again, once we combine it with Trample, that is not the case. Again, Trample cares about dealing lethal damage to the creature that's blocking it. So now if my double strike creature has Trample on it, I'm going to deal 2 damage in the first strike damage step to that 2/2 creature, kill it, and then in the regular damage step, I now have another 2 damage to deal, and the Trample that my creature now has says, well, if you've already dealt lethal damage to that blocking creature, anything else gets trampled over, and that's what will happen. Now you will deal 2 damage to that player because your creature has Trample. So very specific interaction with double strike and Trample. Again, that's why you don't see those abilities combined very often. They work really, really well together. And I think that's about it. You know, I covered a few questions that people had, and I think I covered most of the bases when it comes to generally how combat works and some of the misconceptions that people have about it. I hope I was clear enough. You know, I'm not actually reading the rule book in front of me here. I'm just sort of going over it in a casual way that people can understand. Of course, people have comments, and there will always be those very helpful people around that will clarify in the comments below, as well as me. And if you got comments about anything else or topics you'd like me to cover, I will do so in the next video. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.